We'll try to do that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David DiBiase from AARP here again to give you a brief welcome message at the start of this program. We're thrilled to be collaborating with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University, bringing AARP members a rich sampling of the wonderful programs that they offer at Ollie Mason. Our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrus, was a champion of lifelong learning. She started an institute back in 1963. And one of the quotes from back then was, "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, to achieve new heights of knowledge. The eagerness to learn has no age restrictions." So with that, we're excited that you're learning something new. Studies have shown that our brain is stimulated when we learn new things and when we pursue new interests, and AARP encourages you to give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that challenges your thinking, something you enjoy, and causes you to grapple with new concepts and new ideas. So it's never too late to discover a new cognitively stimulating activity. And so with that, we applaud you for being here today. We thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer DeSano, who's the Executive Director of Ollie Mason. She'll tell you a little bit more about the program and introduce you to our author. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, David. Let me just make sure you can see me. There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at George Mason University. I am the Executive Director of Ollie, and it is my pleasure to be working with AARP to bring this collaborative programming to you. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute has just reached its 30th anniversary. We started out as a learning and retirement institute in 1991 with one classroom and a handful of members. And now we are across 3 campuses in Northern Virginia, and we're about 1,200 members strong. So we're very proud of our achievements, and we're so happy to be here today to share with you programming. At Ollie, you can attend lectures, you can enjoy clubs, and you can also volunteer in many, many ways to support the organization. To learn more about Ollie, you can go to olli.gmu.edu. And I do want to say welcome to all of our Ollie Mason members who are already members, and also to our wonderful AARP community, all of those of you who are in Northern Virginia or across Virginia, as well as across the United States. We're very happy that you're going to be enjoying this program today. It is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today. Richard Bell is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. He is the author of the book Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. The book was a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Prize and the 2020 Harriet Tubman Prize. Rick has held major research fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Library of Congress, and is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Award. This very morning, the New York Times also announced that Rick is a recipient of this year's Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, one of the largest and most prestigious research awards for humanities scholars in the world. Please welcome Richard Bell.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Maybe good morning for some of you, depending on what time zone you are watching this in. This is a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks to Jennifer and to David, who you heard from, and from Meg behind the scenes at Ollie Mason as well, for making this possible. It takes a village to do an event this large. I'm watching people streaming in here, so thank you for this opportunity. My plan for the day is to talk about my recent book, which is called Stolen, and set it in some larger context for you for about 50 55 minutes, something like that. And along the way, we'll actually stop and I will try to make this a bit more interactive than these passive Zoom webinars can sometimes be, because as David said, stimulating our brains is what it's all about each and every day. So I will pause at some point in my presentation and ask you guys to weigh in on something. And if you want to weigh in, the easiest way to do that is to use the chat button, which you should be able to see somewhere on your screen. You should be able to send a message to panelists, which means that David, Meg, and I will be able to see those comments from you when the time comes. And I'm going to ask Meg to read some of those comments aloud to me when the time comes. And then, of course, at the end of my prepared remarks, we're going to have lots of time, with any luck, for some of your questions. And you'll have noticed there's a Q&A tab as well, which is how you can post a question to all of us up here and try and get some of those answered in the time we have left. If you're wondering, by the way, my accent is a British accent. I'm originally from London, grew up not too far from there, went to college in the UK till I was 21, till I graduated, and then came to America to get a PhD in American history, which, everyone at the time thought was pretty strange. And there's a recording in progress. Which everyone at the time thought was pretty strange. But I've been here ever since. I love this country. I'm very happy to be here. I became a US citizen about, a couple of years ago, and got to vote 6 months ago in my first ever presidential election, which was an exciting time for any new American citizen, myself most especially. I'm married to someone from America, a woman from Missouri, who I met in grad school. When you grow up in London, you never expect to be married to someone from Missouri, but here we are. And my wife and I, have two terrifyingly American children, 7-year-old Ruby and 4-year-old Rosie, who has a birthday next month, living with us in our home near College Park, Maryland. Wherever you are, I hope you're happy and healthy. So let's get started. I'm gonna go ahead and share my slides here. Always a moment of truth for any Zoom presenter. And then I'm going to dive right in. And let me just tell you, all of you, that obviously this is sobering stuff. So bear that in mind. We'll be talking about some serious issues. And I want to remind everyone, too, that while I'm on good university Wi-Fi here in my office at the University of Maryland, sometimes that Wi-Fi plays tricks on me and just kicks me out of whatever I'm doing in the middle of whatever Zoom meeting I might be having. So if that happens today, and I do not expect it to, I will mysteriously disappear for 30 seconds. And while I'm logging back in, David or Meg will come on and do a tap dance or some slam poetry to keep you occupied for 30 seconds till I come back. So that's the plan. Hopefully that won't happen. But if I don't say that, then it definitely will happen. So I'm sort of preventing it by saying it out loud. Let us get started. We've got a lot to talk about. This is serious stuff, of course, because Cornelius Sinclair was just 10 years old. And he was trapped. He was stuck, he was locked, imprisoned in the belly of a small ship that looked a lot like this one. A small ship that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philadelphia's market in Arago, shoved a gag into his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him aboard. And it was dark below the ship's waterline in the hold. But Cornelius could see enough down there to know that he was not the only child locked there. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him. 4 other African-American boys. One looked about his size. He was probably 10 or 11, like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was shorter and smaller than everyone else. He might have been as young as 8 years old. Yesterday, all of these boys, all 5 of them, had been free, like you and me. But today, they were enslaved, prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep, deep South. And if their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August of 1825, one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, the city of Philadelphia was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Its gridded streets and its tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. And they did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time as the city of brotherly love, as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of the American anti-slavery movement at the time. But of course, to criminals, to kidnappers, none of that stuff mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And this was a product of its location. I don't know where in the United States you are today, so it's always good to have a map. Philadelphia was the nearest major free city on the East Coast to the slave South in the 1820s. Philadelphia lay just, 40 miles north of what's called the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to its south, including Maryland, where I'm sitting right now, and Virginia, where George Mason University is located. As Pennsylvania and other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 or so years after the American Revolution, that boundary along Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for African Americans. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, the Mason-Dixon line seemed to divide two worlds, separating northern free states from the southern slave states. And Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line along Pennsylvania's southern border made Philadelphia's many free black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby slave states. They preyed on the members of the city's free black community relentlessly. They put bullseyes on their backs. They put prices on their heads. And the people they stole away could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, three of the new territories and states rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. The American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane and pick cotton, and they would take almost anyone to do that unpaid work. Now, buying a small percentage of their black laborers from kidnappers of free people was not likely their first choice, but their options were circumscribed. Planters down there in the Deep South had been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since the year 1808, the year that lawmakers in Washington, D.C., about 10 miles from where I'm sitting, had passed legislation that outlawed any further imports of black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purpose of enslaving them in the United States. That 1808 federal decision is not super famous, unless you're an historian, but it was important. It was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America. A turning point that would spur the growth of an American internal domestic slave trade within the slave states of the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the US tried to satisfy those Southwestern settlers' demands for black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland and Virginia, where there were some masters willing to sell some of their laborers for the right price. And all of that was legal, of course. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more than that. And the stronger the demand, the more tempting and the more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free kids like Cornelius from northern cities like Philadelphia, then smuggle them, launder them into that legal supply chain, and then sell them in that vast new southwestern slave market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free Black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of an inter-regional kidnapping operation. Philadelphia had become a northern terminus or point of origin for something I call America's reverse underground railroad. And I'll use that term a few times this afternoon. So let me reiterate what I mean by it. America's reverse underground railroad is, as I see it, the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free African Americans, usually from northern towns and cities. And this reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they of course ran in opposite directions, yes? And they existed for completely different purposes, right? But because they're opposites, they're also sort of mirror images of each other. On the Underground Railroad, that's the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one. On the Underground Railroad, enslaved people abandoned southern plantations and trekked usually northward, dreaming of new lives and new opportunities and freedom. On America's Underground Railroad, let's start that again, on America's reverse Underground Railroad, free Black people would be stolen from freedom in northern cities like Philadelphia and made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. It's the opposite. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman would risk their lives and their own liberty to help Black fugitives make these epic journeys of freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, the conductors were kidnappers, human traffickers, motivated by money. Both networks, one obviously good and heroic, the other obviously evil and monstrous, both networks roared to life at the same time in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery up in the North and in the South. Both networks, one good, one bad, were loosely organized, opportunistic. Both ran on secrecy. Both relied on small circles of trusted participants, on forged documents, false identities, and disguise. The direction of travel was usually completely different. But the routes taken by freedom seekers going north and by victims of kidnapping made to go south, the routes were largely the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And if that was not enough, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was also roughly the same size. Each one carried each year hundreds of Black adults and children across state lines, half of them towards freedom, half of them towards slavery. Now, most of us, I hope, know a good deal about the Underground Railroad, the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one. Historians have spent decades now studying the strategies and the tactics that Harriet Tubman, her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. Their achievements now command our attention, which is a wonderful thing. There are Underground Railroad walking tours, television shows, museums like this big one in Cincinnati on the left-hand side of the screen. There's another great one on the eastern shore of Maryland. And there's, of course, this recent movie, Harriet. This was one of the last Hollywood films to come out in theaters before the pandemic. Do you remember those days? It's hard to remember them, right? But there was a time in American history, not too long ago, when you could go to a theater and sit with 300 strangers and breathe the same air as them. We were living through a golden age and we did not even know it at the AMC. And Harriet, this movie, was the first time Harriet Tubman had got the big screen Hollywood treatment. If I was a history film critic, I would give it like a B. It's not my favorite film. It's not a perfect film. But I'm really glad it exists. Because it does, like the museums, like the walking tours, like everything else, shine a spotlight on the men and women who created the secret network through which enslaved people could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. So we know a lot about the Underground Railroad. But I think we know far less about what I'm calling today America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of those criminals still remain a secret, even today. Kidnappers never gave public lectures about their work. Human traffickers never went on fundraising tours. Only rarely do their names and their crimes even appear in surviving police files or trial transcripts. Their low profile in surviving legal sources, the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, protected by corruption, and protected by far too much indifference and apathy among ordinary white Americans who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't do anything to stop it. Unlike legal interstate slave traders, who sometimes donated their business papers to Southern colleges and historical societies, the outlaws who built this kidnapping network, America's reverse Underground Railroad, they left no business records, no bundles of private letters for historians like me to discover in the Library of Congress. They didn't write memoirs about their careers. They didn't pose for paintings or photographs, which left journalists and activists merely to guess, as you see here, as to what they might have looked like. But this is a guess. However, as I argue in my recent book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story I tell in Stolen begins, but about every northern town or city with a free Black population. If we think not just about 1825, when this true story begins, but about each and every year between 1808 and the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad stole away likely tens of thousands of free Black people. Many of them children, like Cornelius, under the age of 16. And let me be very clear. Most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. They remain enslaved. Their families and friends would search for them after they'd been stolen away. They would lobby and petition frantically, desperately. They would advertise. They would wait in earnest for news. But usually nothing came. These kids, these adults do not come home. Free Black people in northern cities like Philadelphia had very few white allies in this period of American history, beyond the meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. And what's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, while city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and turned a blind eye to most white-on-black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates or policemen to get involved, to do something. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants, search property, or interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews, they knew exactly what to do and what to say to talk their way out of trouble and to get back to work. I'm keeping an eye on the list of participants here. I see about, what, 218 other logins in addition to myself. I'm guessing all of you have heard of 12 Years a Slave. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie based on a memoir written by a guy named Solomon Northrop, who, of course, was one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, however, Solomon Northrop later escaped Southern slavery. It took him 12 full years of his life to do it, but he did it. And when he did it, he returned home to New York, and then he wrote about it all. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which he wrote in 1853, Solomon Northrop explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed white con men lured him into New York City from his home upstate in 1841. And at the time, Northrop was a well-educated, fully employed, prosperous musician. In his mid-30s, he was also literate. And in Manhattan, they wined him and dined him. And if you've seen the movie, you know they also drugged him. And then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C. Northrop was soon forced onto a slave ship bound for New Orleans. And there, he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his sugarcane fields. In 2013, 8 years ago, that Oscar-winning film, based on Northrop's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue attention to Northrop's ordeal. And if I'm giving out grades for movies about history, I would give the movie 12 Years a Slave an A. I think it's an incredibly important piece of cinema. I think every American should watch it. It's not easy to watch. It's not supposed to be, but it's important. However, both the memoir and that movie nonetheless offer, I think, distorted, maybe even misleading views of the people whom the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how those agents usually made their money. It turns out that Northrop's experience on America's reverse Underground Railroad was actually not at all typical of everyone else's. Its kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northrop. No. They preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with lies and with tricks that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on their own 2 feet in small overland convoys known as coffles. And their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. Their prisoners were vastly more likely to be sold off in ones and twos along the way, in furtive, all-cash deals, to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more slaves, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical on America's reverse Underground Railroad, and all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my book. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. As you heard, their captors hustled them onto that little ship I mentioned just outside Philadelphia, which you can see in the top right-hand corner of this map. Their captors warehoused them for a week or two in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line, just above the word Nanticoke at the bottom of your screen. And after a week or two in those safe houses, their captors then marched them onwards, halfway across this vast continent, towards the Deep South, where they tried to sell all 5 free children as slaves. Look at this distance. This, of course, was a monstrous distance, a soul-destroying journey for these children. A journey, by the way, on your own 2 feet of 2 million steps. We only have limited time together today, so in the interest of time, I'm going to pass over the experience of this journey, though I have a lot to say about it in the book. And likewise, at my publisher's request, I'm going to pass over much of the book's second half, in which we learn that some, but not all, of these 5 boys made a miraculous escape and began the astonishing Odyssey home to Philadelphia, referred to in the book's subtitle. All I can say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe and 2 adult women who made this journey too, what they made happen next was indeed astonishing to them and to me 200 years later. It would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. Let's pivot here. And let me tell you that the gang that stole Cornelius was led by 2 white men whose names were Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson. Cannon, Johnson. And it was their habit to warehouse most children they kidnapped from Philadelphia in the attics of their houses, which, as I said, were out near the Maryland-Delaware line, in a remote, underpopulated corner of the Delmarva Peninsula. And Cannon and Johnson would keep these kids captive there, sometimes for weeks at a time, for however long it took them to organize the children's onward journey across the country and into the Deep South, where they could be sold as slaves. As you can imagine, there are lots of unanswered questions about the reverse Underground Railroad in general, and plenty in particular about how gangs like the Cannon-Johnson gang used private homes as prisons, how they prevented kids inside from escaping, why neighbors failed to sound the alarm, and why law enforcement never successfully raided these properties. One of the big breakthroughs I had in the course of my research for this book was a day back in 2013, when I found a letter written to the officers of an anti-slavery group known as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society by one of their own, by their chief investigator, their in-house private eye. The letter was dated 1819. And I think this letter sheds light on some of the questions I just asked. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to do something I don't often do when I'm talking about this book. I'm going to take you inside the research a little bit. I'm going to tell you, using a mixture of direct quotation from the letter and some of my own words, what that letter said. And then when I'm done, I'm going to ask all of you out there what you think that letter reveals about how this particular gang of kidnappers and human traffickers operated, and fundamentally how they got away with all of this for so long. So listen carefully, and then if you want to share some answers, you can use the chat box to direct some comments to the panelists that Meg and I will be able to see and then introduce to everyone else. So let's get started. In May of 1819, and of course, 1819 is 6 years before Cornelius and these other boys vanished from Philadelphia. In May of 1819, Sarah Hageman, a free black girl aged just 11 years old, has disappeared from her job near the waterworks just outside Philly. After Sarah's widowed mother makes a public appeal for information, a tip-off leads to the arrest of Sarah's white employer, a woman named Margaret Ward. At her trial for kidnapping in that October, Margaret Ward confesses that, yes, she kidnapped Sarah, and then she sold Sarah to a stolen goods dealer, who then sold this girl on to Jesse Cannon, the notorious human trafficker out on Maryland's Eastern Shore. So suddenly there's a lead, a hot lead. So 2 weeks later, in early November, Philadelphia's anti-slavery group, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, dispatches their best man, their in-house private eye, John Willits, out to the eastern shore of Maryland to try to find Sarah Hageman, rescue her, and bring her home. This guy, John Willits, was a dogged and experienced private eye. And he arrived in Denton, Maryland, across the Chesapeake Bay, on November the 13th. He brought with him a young man named Miller, who knew young Sarah Hageman, and so hoped to be able to identify that child by a scar that Sarah had on her forehead and another scar she had on one of her knees. But the pair of them, the private eye, the family friend, ran into trouble on the Eastern Shore almost immediately. The sheriff out there in Denton informed them that the man they were looking for, this Jesse Cannon, the notorious human trafficker, actually lived beyond his jurisdiction, not in Maryland at all, but across the state line in Sussex County, Delaware. It took Willits, the private eye, another full day to track down a Delaware judge willing to issue a search warrant for Jesse Cannon's house, and then a second day to persuade a Delaware constable to actually execute that order. And the officer in question, a constable named Robeson, was none too keen to do so. He lived there and he'd heard that Jesse Cannon and his partner Joseph Johnson were holed up in the house, and that both men, Cannon and Johnson, were likely to be armed and dangerous when they arrived. So it is with reluctance that he executes that order, but he does. And the next day, November the 15th, the private eye, John Willits, the family friend, Mr. Miller, and this reluctant Delaware constable arrive at Jesse Cannon's house on horseback as the day is turning to dusk. Peering through a back door, Willits, the private eye, sees 3 or 4 small black girls inside the house, although none seems to match Sarah's description. Miller, who knew Sarah back in Philadelphia, is a few paces behind. Miller thinks he catches a glimpse of Sarah disappearing through the house's back garden and into the woods with some men. But before Miller can follow her there, Joseph Johnson suddenly darts from behind a corner of the house and presents a pistol to Mr. Miller's head and swears that if he attempts to advance another step, I will blow your brains out. Johnson demands to know what these 3 men are doing on their property. Without dropping his weapon, he peers curiously at the search warrant the private eye Willits has in hand, but declares that search warrant void because the sun was set and therefore the day is over. Yes, it has today's date on it, but it's after dark now, so it doesn't count. And he swears to shoot the first man who should attempt to raise a latch on any door anywhere in this house. Only at the private eye's prodding does the legal official, the constable, insist that the warrant is still good. If it has a date on it, it's good till midnight. Joseph Johnson has to concede the point, but he doesn't do much more. He does now allow Constable Robeson and Mr. Miller to search the place for Sarah Hageman, but it is only, and I think this is important, it is only on condition that no questions should be asked of any other black people they might discover inside. And so the search begins. While the private eye remains at the front door, Constable Robeson and Mr. Miller are allowed to venture upstairs with Joseph Johnson and his father-in-law, Jesse Cannon, attending them with cocked pistols in their hands. Try imagining conducting a search of a house with guns pointed at you, loaded guns. When Joseph Johnson unbolted the door leading to his second-floor attic, Constable Robeson and Mr. Miller come face to face with 5 black women bound together by heavy chains. The 5 of them sat in terrified silence round a cold fireplace. With Jesse Cannon's pistol pressed to his head, Mr. Miller hastily inspects each of them, looking for Sarah Hageman's telltale scars on the forehead and the knees. As he passes among them, each person's face became faintly illuminated by a transient hope that she would be claimed, only to immediately relapse again into the settled features of despair as she saw him pass on without the ability to save her. None of these 5 women was Sarah Hageman. They were all too old, all of them teenagers by Miller's reckoning. Sarah's 11. Miller and Robeson continued their house search for a few more minutes, but Sarah Hageman was nowhere to be found. Joseph Johnson and Jesse Cannon seemed to be enjoying watching this rescue mission fail in front of their eyes. And so they snidely insisted that their visitors should go ahead and examine the outbuildings too. And so they did. Inside one shack in the yard, the private eye, Willits, found 2 black boys and 3 more black girls. None of them bore Sarah's marks. By then it was obvious to everyone that they were not going to find her. Sarah's captors had evidently heard that their posse was coming and had hustled her, and only her, off the property before they'd arrived. Night was falling fast now, and with no hope of finding this girl now remaining, Willits, the private eye, Constable Robeson, and Mr. Miller soon had to give up and go home. In lantern light, they retreated to their horses as Joseph Johnson and Jesse Cannon jeered and hollered at them. The next morning, Willits and Miller returned to Philadelphia empty-handed. No one in Sarah Hageman's family ever heard from her again. As a reminder, we know everything I've just told you because of the report that Willits submitted 2 weeks later to his bosses at the anti-slavery group. That is the source that I've been quoting here these last few minutes. And as you've heard, that letter is sobering stuff. But for an historian, of course, it's also incredibly revealing about how this gang operates. But what does it reveal? That's what I'm hoping you'll use the chat button to tell me, if you're willing to type a few words or a sentence or two. Who can pop in the chat something that you noticed about this attempted rescue of Sarah Hageman that explains how her kidnappers, the same gang of kidnappers that will kidnap Cornelius 6 years later, how these kidnappers were able to operate successfully for so long? Tell me some clue to their awful success that you heard revealed in this tragic story. Pop something in the chat, please. We're in webinar mode, so I can't go to raised hands easily. Unfortunately, we can't bring you up on the screen easily, but if you're willing to use the chat, I'd love to see you pop some ideas in there. And Meg, as soon as they start to appear, and I hope they do, you could start reading them out slowly. Meg, can you hear me? You're muted.
Yes, I can hear you. I have a couple comments now, and they are now popping up fast and furious. So
yeah, the first couple or 3.
It's moving through too fast for me to read. So hold on. Okay, the first one says white. Wow, it's just it's moving off the screen. Okay, the first one. There we go. It says white privilege to the max. Most likely paid officials off. The judge or the police were in cahoots with the kidnappers.
So let me stop you there for a minute. We'll come back to Megan in 30 seconds and to pick up some more ideas to give her some time to grapple with this onslaught of great comments coming in. But let me just quickly reflect on those first ideas, right? So there is the idea, the hint in this story, that someone is corrupt or bent, as the British would say about policemen. That someone in a law office somewhere, maybe on the Maryland side, maybe on the Delaware side, maybe even Constable Robeson, we do not know. Someone seems to have given up to the kidnappers the fact that this posse is coming out from Philadelphia to search this property. We can't be sure it's someone in law enforcement, but given that the kidnappers seem to know that the posse is coming for Sarah Hageman, the girl whose name is on the warrant, it seems that maybe someone in law enforcement has talked. So maybe they've been bought off and bribed, or maybe they have other reasons for giving up that information. But that seems to be a useful lead for us as investigators to explore. Meg, do you want to pick out a couple of other ideas?
Yes. There are several about the kidnappers using threats to keep their victims.
So let's
and that the kidnappers really didn't face any consequences for their illegal actions, knew it and took full advantage of it.
So that's right. So we could go in several different directions. I'm going to reflect very narrowly on one part of that, and then Meg can prompt me with some more in a second. So threats. Did you notice how, the specter of violence looms over almost every sentence in that description? Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson are clearly incredibly violent men. We know that several ways. We know that most obviously because they're waving around guns in this story, and they seem like they are cocked and ready to fire them. Now, no gun is fired in this story, but the only people with guns in this story are the bad guys. If I knew for certainty that any of the good guys in this story had guns, I would have told you that, but there's no evidence that they did. The bad guys have the guns in this story, and they wave them around, maybe because they want to fire them, or maybe because they want to be perceived as being dangerous, violent people, as a way to have these investigators go away, consider their options. And of course, that same culture of violence, that same threat of violence, are going to be the same tools that members of this gang, however many there are in this gang, are going to use to kidnap free Black people and then silence them, intimidate them, and subordinate them. There may be more kidnapped Black people on this property than there are white kidnappers. But the white kidnappers are heavily armed and apparently willing to use those weapons or be seen to threaten to do so. So the threat of violence hangs over this. Meg, give me another idea.
Okay, one of the big ideas in this, of course, the kidnappers were tipped off by someone, but also that both neighbors and police turned a blind eye to what was going on. And the other sentiment is the fact that the search warrant was listed for a person, not searching for people who were taken in a crime.
Yeah, let me reflect on both of those. Two great ideas. Thank you for your extraordinary work, all you guys out there doing this. So any neighbors within shouting distance will have been well aware that this was going on, given the relatively high volume of Black people passing through this property. But the only tip-offs they're giving seem to be to the kidnappers that this posse is coming, because it's not certain that the leak is coming from the sheriff's office. It seems likely perhaps, but it's not certain. So if it's not coming from the sheriff's office, then someone along the way has seen these kidnappers come and has run ahead to tell Cannon and Johnson. That's not a perfect explanation because it does not explain how they know they're coming for Sarah. But it seems that the neighbors are definitely not allies of the kidnapped people or of these rescuers, right? The neighbors seem to be either cowed into silence or actively in cahoots here. And then, of course, there's the jurisdictional issues here as well. This is taking place in two states, Maryland and Delaware, both of which are slave states. And so in slave states, it is by no means uncommon to go into someone's house and find shackles for human beings in those houses, or even to sometimes find human beings in shackles in those houses, in those properties, in these plantations. And so the burden of proof for any would-be rescuer is to prove that a person in chains who is Black is not actually a slave, because the default assumption in a slave state is that, yep, that person belongs to me, he or she is one of my slaves. And yet the key to all of this, of course, is the fact that Johnson does not allow these investigators to ask questions of anyone who is not Sarah Hageman. So these investigators never find out whether these other 5, 10, 15 shackled Black people are legally purchased and owned slaves, or like Sarah, have been kidnapped from freedom, because they're not allowed to ask and there's a gun pointed to their head. And as someone pointed out there, the way that search warrants work in this period in slave states when looking for kidnapped free Black people is very different to the way search warrants work today. My understanding is that today a search warrant is for a property, but it seems in this case the search warrant is for a person. And so it's good for Sarah Hageman only, and it is not good for anyone else who they may suspect but cannot prove to be the victim of kidnapping. And that works to Joseph Johnson and Jesse Cannon's advantage here. All right, Meg, anything else? I think we've covered a lot of the main basis here. Anything else? And you're muted.
Yeah, I was just trying to get there. The other thing is that they were obviously well-versed in using the letter of the law and legal state boundaries and difference among them to escape prosecution.
Yeah. Huge.
And go ahead.
Let's maybe end there, because that's a good final note to end on, right? So this gang has a safe house right close to the Delaware line. In fact, what I don't tell you in this story is they have a very similar house on the other side of the line, on the Maryland side. And they're perfectly happy to jump back and forth between those two houses, between those two jurisdictions, between those two states, knowing that these are entirely different legal jurisdictions, and they can hide in that jurisdictional conflict frequently here. This is clearly also not their first rodeo, right? They have been busted before, and they've got away with it before, as far as we can tell, right? They know how they can use, as someone said, the letter of the law, the threat of violence, to minimize their vulnerability here to being arrested here. I know there's more to say here. I'm noticing there's still people adding to the comments, and that is wonderful. But I do want to keep going here. So thank you, Meg, for jumping in and making that possible. You guys are amazing. So let me give you my own very quick summary of the letter's takeaways, and you have already hit many of these bases already. As you've noticed, rather than record a daring, triumphant rescue, a happy ending, that letter instead offers rare first-hand testimony to the limits of law enforcement's powers. The letter also shines light upon the size of Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson's operations, and it shines lights upon the efficacy of the tactics they used to protect their black market business and preserve their own liberty. Despite his own years of experience as a private investigator, this guy Willits from Philly struggles mightily to even gain the element of surprise. He'd struggled to secure a search warrant. He'd struggled to persuade county constables to enforce a search warrant. Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson were evidently well connected, much feared locally, and consequently they had beaten him easily. Discovering Detective Willits' report to his bosses at the anti-slavery group was a godsend for me. Now, as you heard, it didn't feature Cornelius. In fact, it took place in 1819, but it nonetheless provided a way to illuminate an otherwise shadowy part of the experience that Cornelius and these other four boys would have gone through when they arrived in the exact same house as captives 6 years later in 1825. And I mention all this because I want all of us to understand why historians have so far written so very little about America's reverse Underground Railroad, why many of you might not have heard of this before. The problem, of course, is sources, evidence. The oldest of the five boys I write about in the book, a boy named Sam, he was only 15 when he vanished. The rest, like Cornelius, were much younger. One of these five boys was homeless. The other four came from families in different degrees of destitution. Most of them could not read or write. Only Cornelius could. Which is to say, these five boys are not the sort of people to leave behind many written traces in libraries and archives, historical societies. And that's a problem, right? Because this is history. It's true. And historians need sources and evidence, lots of sources, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are true and fair. And the stories and the struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers and diaries and memoirs often remain untold, unstudied, because of the lack of readily available sources. So to reconstruct Cornelius Sinclair's journey along America's reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters written to or from this guy on the screen. He's the mayor of Philadelphia, and he will belatedly wade into this story, almost too late, but he does. And I also turned first to coverage of Cornelius' disappearance in a single anti-slavery magazine. And to be clear, historians have known about these modest sources for some time, but on their own, they turn out to be too few, too thin to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing Odyssey into and out of American slavery. So of course I've had to go looking elsewhere, which is to say, digging around in any archive I could find for scraps of information that, when stitched together, could help flesh this all out. And along the way, there's been a lot of days spent finding nothing useful at all. Looking for, what do they say? Looking for needles in haystacks, but finding only more hay. And if you've done your own historical or genealogical research, I'm sure that experience of frustration is very familiar to you too. But of course, if you keep at it, it's worth it. Over 6 years of research, I unearthed dozens and dozens of needles buried in those haystacks. New sources about this case buried within 35 archives in 14 different states and the District of Columbia. The good news is I'm not going to list them all now. But let me tell you quickly about 3 of them, just to give you a flavor. One thing I found, with the help of another historian, was the handwritten notes of a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and which decided the fate of one of these boys. The fate of Cornelius, actually. I also discovered a pair of letters in which one of his kidnappers named his accomplices and described their roles in detail, an astonishing find that I never thought would have existed, but it does. And I found it, and I copied it into the back of my book so you can read it too. But most effectively of all, at least for me, was something I found in a Philadelphia newspaper pretty early on, put there by Cornelius's father, grieving father, 2 days after his son went missing. It's of course a missing persons ad. And because it's short, as you can see here, I can read it to you. It says, "Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy nearly 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, it's feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad. He's pretty stout-built. He's got thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak, and his left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of my son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair." As you can imagine, I've read this missing persons ad hundreds of times in my life. Every time I look at it, the same 2 words jump out at me like they're written 50 foot high, 60 foot high. Afflicted parents. All of us have parents. Some of us are parents of children. I have 2. The thought that my children, my young children, could be taken away from me, and all I could do to hope to get them back is place an ad in a newspaper seeking information and hope that someone sees it who can help. It just rips at me in a really primal way. Afflicted parents. That seems like the understatement of the 19th century for this poor family. So before I go looking with Meg's help in the Q&A box to see what questions you can put there, let me wrap up these last 2 or 3 minutes with a couple of reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on that railroad is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that Black lives have always mattered. And so any true story about free children being ripped from their families, swallowed up by American slavery, is worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his other fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities, and Black freedom in the United States was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over the same period. Now, as I said, I am not allowed to spill all the beans about this book's astonishing second half, or tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. But I will drop a few big hints here. And I will say that the dogged efforts of everyone involved in trying to save Cornelius and these other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies, the aftermath of their campaign would radicalize Black communities across the free states and inspire African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense and mutual protection. And their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging white abolitionists, like the two white women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet, to try to focus the Northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families being forcibly separated by kidnappers, by slave catchers, by slave traders, by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. And this 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage kidnappers and slaveholders and Southerners more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War. And it set in motion a chain of court challenges against it, political retaliations to it, that culminated in the passage through Congress in Washington of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery abomination of a law that put this entire country on a collision course with civil war. So to conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. What happened to him and the things that he and the other boys made happen next would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy must not be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of his particular story. A 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery in 1825. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. All right, thank you very much. I am looking forward to your comments and questions. I am required to put up this promotional literature on the final page. Whether you buy the book is up to you. This book has been out for 2 years, so there's no pressure from me. It should be in most of your libraries. You should be able to get a copy easily. It's available in various formats. And if any of you are the sort of people that like to get signed copies, you can certainly send me an email, as you see on the screen here, and we can figure that out. But mostly, I would like to try to field some of your questions and hear some of your comments in the time we have left. So I'm going to rely on Meg, actually, to go fishing in the Q&A box for me, and maybe field me one question at a time in some of the minutes that we have left. Meg, anything there?
Okay, here's an interesting from Frances Watson. She says she's an African American born in Milford, Delaware, and this reminds her of a story told by her father when she was a child, that when he was a boy, there was a woman named Patty Cannon who was going to kidnap him and a friend. A white man hid them in their barn, and they were able to escape.
So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I bet you noticed the common last name. She just referred to a woman named Patty Cannon, marauding in Delaware, kidnapping legally free American people. And do you remember earlier on, I was talking about 2 white kidnappers, Joseph Johnson and Jesse Cannon. Jesse Cannon and Patty Cannon were married for a while until Jesse died and Patty Cannon took over the business with her son-in-law, Joseph Johnson. So the Patty Cannon you're referring to is a Patty Cannon who actually features in this book in a quite a major way. My book is, among other things, one of the first scholarly studies of Patty Cannon's career, a woman around whom many layers of mythology have been built. But that sort of story that I think you said your dad told you is a story lots of African Americans heard growing up in Delaware and on the Eastern Shore of Maryland throughout the 19th century, and maybe by the sounds of it into the 20th century as well. Patty Cannon was a bogeyman, I guess a bogey woman would be the way to say it, right? A sort of nightmare figure that people told their children terrifying stories about, even long after Patty Cannon was actually dead, as a way to get those free children to take their freedom and its protection and preservation seriously. So that those free Black boys and girls growing up in Delaware and Maryland and Philadelphia too, didn't trust every stranger they met who offered to give them some money or some food if they followed them this way. So we know that those stories proliferated about Patty Cannon, about Jesse Cannon, about Joseph Johnson among the free Black community of these three states as a way to try to build vigilance among this otherwise quite vulnerable free Black community. So it's amazing to hear that from someone's own family. Thank you for sharing that. Much appreciated. Meg, go again.
Did abolitionists or anti-slavery societies actually target the reverse Underground Railroad at all? Or was their resource exclusively focused on the Underground Railroad and legislation?
So the answer is all of the above. So the idea that there's a coherent anti-slavery movement or a laser-focused abolition campaign is actually a bit two-dimensional. The anti-slavery movement and the abolition campaign takes many forms and is populated by a wide variety of stakeholders. When we think of abolitionists, I think we tend to naturally think of white lawyers, Quakers, ministers, William Lloyd Garrison, people like that. Maybe we think of Frederick Douglass, free Black leaders and public speakers, as we should. But it's also true that every enslaved person probably was an anti-slavery activist for themselves, right? No enslaved person ever consents to be in slavery, so they're always trying to work to liberate themselves, and that, of course, is anti-slavery work. And we know that the free Black community in Delaware, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, you name it, are often valuable allies for white lawyers and white ministers trying to learn as much as they can about what the Black experience is like and the best way to assist. So this is a biracial effort. It's not always a well-integrated effort, but it is a biracial effort. And we know that the things they targeted, the ways they tried to spend their time and money and resources to fight slavery, varied enormously. We can find anti-slavery activists trying to get elected, which is by trying to form political parties like the Liberty Party, which fails, the Equal Rights Party, which fails, the Free Soil Party, which fails, the Republican Party, which succeeds. The political track. There's what's called the moral suasion track, which is getting white Northerners who just don't really care about Southern slavery to start giving a damn about Southern slavery, to get white Northerners off their couches, to give money to the anti-slavery movement, to go to a meeting, to vote Republicans or whoever into office, like Lincoln. So that's a moral suasion campaign. There's, of course, direct action to support the Underground Railroad, right? To help Harriet Tubman, to be Harriet Tubman, to be the next Harriet Tubman, to help fugitives from slavery any way they can. And yes, there is a sustained effort beginning right around here, right around 1825, arguably with this case, for white and Black anti-slavery activists to do something to try to turn the tide of kidnapping, which is ravaging free Black communities in places like Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, New York, and Boston. It doesn't mean they succeed, but my God, they spend a lot of time, money, care, and energy trying to deter kidnappers, trying to arrest and hold kidnappers accountable, to breed a culture of vigilance and wariness among the free Black people of the United States. And much of this book also tells that story.
Okay. I've got one. This ad reminds me of the Lost Friends ads that were described in Lisa Wingate's The Book of Lost Friends. How heartbreaking for their families.
Yeah, that's right. So I've not yet read, I think it's a novel, right? The Wingate book. I've not read it yet, but it's based on the true thing, right? That after slavery, meaning after 1865, after the end of the Civil War, a great many newly free African Americans set out to find their loved ones from whom they've been sold away, right? So if you were born on a plantation in Maryland in the 1850s with your family, it's quite likely that by the coming of the Civil War, you've been sold somewhere else, to Georgia, to Mississippi, to Alabama, and your family have been dispersed or not sold with you. So when slavery ends in the carnage of the Civil War, you and your family have to find each other. You and your friends have to find each other. You and your children have to find each other. And so people place ads in newspapers. They're called last seen ads, saying, the last time I saw my mother was on this plantation in Maryland. She's this tall, she looks like this, she has a scar on her forehead. Please help me find her. Or the last time I saw my child, he was being sold away, put in a wagon, headed for Georgia. He was this tall. These ads are heartbreaking, as you point out, and they're real. And there's a project at Villanova University led by my friend, Professor Judith Giesberg, Giesberg, Judith Giesberg, to collect as many of these last seen advertisements and turn them into a database which scholars can use to answer important questions. I think if you Google last seen project, you will probably find that database in its emerging stages. You should look at it, you should poke around. It will break your heart, but it will remind you of just how many Black families were ripped apart by slavery and dispersed, whether kidnapping is part of their story or whether legal slave trading is part of their story. The result is the same, divided Black families.
Okay. What was the penalty for kidnapping, transporting, and selling individuals? Was there?
Yeah, great question. There was. Kidnapping is illegal in every state of the Union in 1825. Kidnapping is illegal in Pennsylvania. It's illegal in Maryland. It's illegal in Delaware. It's illegal in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It's illegal in Mississippi. All places that appear in this story. But there are lots of things which are illegal in the books, but which happen anyway, whether that be jaywalking or suicide or lots of things. Doesn't mean that enforcement of anti-kidnapping law is particularly robust. In fact, I would argue that the racial climate, not only in the southern slave states, but even in some of the free soil states, is toxic enough, racialized enough that Black people who are the victims of these sort of crimes cannot rely on the local policeman, cannot rely on local judges, cannot always rely even on the mayor of the city to help them, to protect their rights to not be kidnapped every day. So free Black populations often find that their best allies are themselves. And that's why I talked about new strategies for self-defense and mutual protection at the end of this. So free Black people often have to take justice into their own hands because they know that the courts will not do so. Now, occasionally the courts exceed their expectations and do apprehend kidnappers. Some of the members of this kidnapping gang, the Cannon Johnson gang, some of them will be rounded up, will be prosecuted by the end of this book, some but not all. And I'm not going to say too much more about that. So sometimes justice is served, but many more times it isn't.
Okay. How many people are estimated to have been stolen in this way? And for what period of time did this situation exist?
You guys are asking great questions. I love these questions. So numbers. You heard me say in the talk that we think that likely tens of thousands of free Black adults and children were stolen from freedom in northern towns and cities, trafficked and enslaved in the South. Where do we get that number from? Tens of thousands. Well, let me flip it around. Because the other thing I said right around the same time was that roughly the same number of people who are kidnapped into slavery as escape from slavery on the Underground Railroad. So that must be tens of thousands too, right? Escaping slavery. How do we know that? How do we know how many people escaped slavery on the Underground Railroad? Historians, if you ask them, if you ask Eric Foner in Columbia University in New York, he'll say maybe 40,000. If you ask him how he knows that, he will look at his shoes because he doesn't know that with certainty. But he can give you a rough estimate because he has looked at a variety of sources, whether they are census records, whether they are plantation records, whether they are runaway slave ads, whether they are the receiving ledgers of William Still in the Philadelphia Underground Railroad office. He's looked at a variety of documents, none of which tell the full story of the full scale of the Underground Railroad, but all of which shed light on little pieces of it. And he's put them together and said, our best guess is the Underground Railroad helped maybe 40,000 people escape slavery. It's a guess. It's an estimate. And for the reverse Underground Railroad, you have to do the same thing. You have to use the same strategies. There is no source, no one document, no Bureau of Labor Statistics, no government agency counting how many people are kidnapped and sold into slavery. No one knows. And so you have to piece different imperfect sources together, whether they be those missing persons ads like the one I showed you, whether they be legal records when kidnappers are prosecuted, whether they be case files in anti-slavery organizations like the one generated by Sarah Hageman that I shared with you. None of these sources are perfect, but all of them add up to a sense that, my God, this is overwhelming. So, my version of that is to say that I spent 8 years of my life looking at one case, the case of these 5 boys. And in the course of looking only for this one case, I personally came across hundreds of other cases that I was not looking for. So what would happen if you and I and all 185 people on this call spent the next 3 years each looking for as many cases as we can? We would eventually be deluged with these things. So I'm pretty confident saying that the scale is roughly tens of thousands between the early 1800s, and when it actually starts is anyone's guess, till at least the coming of the Civil War in 1860. Tens of thousands of people being kidnapped into slavery, and on the Underground Railroad, tens of thousands of people fighting their way out.
Okay, lots of questions about, is this talk going to be available? The answer is yes. It has been broadcast on YouTube. You can find it by searching YouTube for our Ollie channel, which is olli.gmu.edu. And it should be up there. It will come down for a little bit today, have a little bit of editing done to it, and go back up. And as always, for Ollie members, we have a Vimeo site where we put recordings.
Great.
And
any last questions?
When do you think human trafficking actually began?
Oh, geez. How long do we have? So, we know that enslavement of free people, which is another way to define human trafficking, because no one consents to be enslaved, has a very long history. It goes back millennia, centuries. The Romans enslave other people. There is slavery in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, many, many hundreds of years before the Europeans and the Americans perfect it in the centuries after 1492. This is a global story. It's not solely an American story. And in our modern era, of course, human trafficking, modern day slavery continues. Let's all remember that. The United States did destroy slavery as a legal institution in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. But no country on earth has succeeded in destroying illicit, underground, illegal human trafficking. It goes on under our noses in every country on this planet, even though slavery is illegal today. In fact, the numbers we have from investigative journalists and charities as to the size of modern day slavery and modern day human trafficking are staggering. I think the activists today reckon that, what day is it today? It is April the 28th, 2021. Activists tell us that about 40 million people around the world woke up in actual slavery today, even though slavery is illegal everywhere. And in the United States, that number is not zero. Activists tell us that the number in the United States is about 100,000 today, people living in actual slavery, which takes many forms, of course. It could be domestic slavery. It could be debt slavery. It could be sex slavery, and it could be agricultural slavery as well. It's very hard. It's very easy to miss, of course, because there are lots of people living hard lives in America, but I'm talking about actual slaves here, 100,000 today, often concentrated in the big agro businesses in California and Florida, are concentrated in those so-called massage parlors we see on the sides of roads on the edge of every town and city in this country, and concentrated in some households run by diplomats in Washington, D.C. and New York, who are protected from prosecution by diplomatic immunity. So this goes on under our noses today. And if you're as outraged about this as I am, and I'm sure you are, the one thing I'd encourage you to do after you end this talk today is to try to learn more about this phenomenon, modern day slavery, human trafficking today. And there's some very easy ways to do this. You could go to any one of the following 3 websites and learn more from people who've spent their lives trying to fight this slavery fight today. You could go to the website of Free the Slaves. You could go to the website of Anti-Slavery International, or you could go to the website of the Polaris Project. All of these charitable groups, investigative activists, are working to shine a spotlight on this phenomenon, and because hopefully with sunshine, we can get more people to get off their couches and do something about it. Because we all get to decide. We all think if we were alive before the Civil War, we'd all be anti-slavery activists, right? Well, we get to choose. We're alive now. Are we anti-slavery activists now? What are we doing today to combat this continuing fight against unfreedom, against human suffering, against modern day slavery? So I'm probably going to draw a line right there, Meg, if that's okay with you. My email address has been up on the screen for a while now. Do jot it down, folks. If I didn't get to your question, I would love to hear it. I would love to try to answer it. Send me an email. My email address is rjbell@umd.edu. That's University of Maryland. rjbell@umd.edu. I will always reply if you send me an email. If you want to buy a book, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. But do be in contact if you have questions about any of this stuff. I love to talk about this stuff. I think it's important. Obviously, I'm sure you do as well. So with that, I will shut up because I'm losing my voice. And I will throw things back to Meg, who can wrap this up for us. And thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks to AARP. And thanks to GMU for this opportunity to talk with you about this important work.